Picture this. You're miles from civilization, surrounded by the eerie whispers of the forest. The warmth of the campfire flickers, casting shadows that play tricks on your mind. It's supposed to be an adventure, but as the sun sets, something feels off. And it's not the usual noises of nature. No, this time there's something else lurking in the woods, something that might just be watching you. Tonight, we're diving deep into four spine-chilling, true camping horror stories that will make you think twice before heading into the wilderness. Stick around, because trust me, you won't want to miss the shocking conclusion. The Whispering Shadow. First up, the summer of 2015. A group of friends set out for a weekend in the wilds of Washington State. Quiet, peaceful, and far from civilization. They chose a secluded campground deep in the trees, thinking it was the perfect escape. Little did they know they weren't alone. That night, as the group sat around the campfire, everything seemed normal, until they heard it, a faint whispering sound carried on the breeze. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the whispers seemed too clear. They were almost words. They couldn't make them out, but the tone felt, wrong, uneasy. One of them, let's call him Jake, stood up and followed the sound into the trees. No one wanted to follow, but curiosity pulled him deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then suddenly everything stopped. Jake turned around to head back, but as he turned, his flashlight revealed something that made his blood run cold. A shadow, impossibly tall, stood just beyond the reach of his beam. No face, no features, just a dark shape. It didn't move, just stood there watching him. And then it whispered his name. Jake didn't stay to find out what it wanted. He bolted back to the campsite, breathless, terrified. When he arrived, the group didn't believe him at first. That was until the next day when they discovered fresh footprints leading into the woods, not away from them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they found, right at the edge of their camp. The abandoned cabin. Picture yourself in the same Washington woods, but this time it's not just whispers that make your skin crawl. On another camping trip, a group of four friends, Alex, Rachel, Sam, and Emily, found something they weren't expecting, an abandoned cabin. Tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far off the beaten trail. No one in the group had planned on exploring it, but curiosity got the better of them. They ventured inside. As they stepped into the cabin, they noticed how wrong everything felt. Dust was thick in the air, but there was something more. The silence was too still, like the air had been trapped for decades. Alex, being the brave one, wandered into a back room when suddenly he froze. A single rocking chair was gently swaying back and forth, but no one was there. The group understandably wanted to leave, but before they could, they heard a sound. It was faint at first, a creaking on the floorboards above them, like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, heavy steps. They bolted out of the cabin, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. But here's where things took an even darker turn. On the way back to camp, they stumbled across a trail, footprints in the mud. The problem? The footprints were leading into the cabin, not out. All right, imagine you were in their shoes. What would you do? Would you go back and confront whatever's in that cabin? Or would you run for the hills? I mean, I'm pretty sure I'd be out of there faster than a deer in hunting season. The campfire that wouldn't go out. Now let's talk about something that will make you never look at a campfire the same way again. This next story comes from a solo camper, Greg, who was camping in the backcountry of Colorado. Greg loved the solitude of the wilderness. Little did he know, solitude would soon become his worst nightmare. As night fell, Greg lit his campfire, a comforting flicker in the vast, dark emptiness around him. It burned strong at first, but then something strange happened. It wouldn't go out. No matter how much wood he added, no matter how hard he tried, the flames stayed unnervingly bright. It didn't make sense. There was no wind, no reason for the fire to be so strong. Greg thought it was just the firewood, until he saw it, a figure barely visible through the flickering flames, standing just outside the light. It wasn't a person, not quite. It was too tall, too distorted, but it didn't move, not at first. As Greg stared, paralyzed, the flames seemed to grow higher, as if feeding off the figure's presence. The fire, once comforting, now felt dangerous. He tried to leave, but the fire wouldn't let him. It wouldn't let him go anywhere. But just as panic began to set in, the figure started walking toward him, slowly, deliberately, and the fire went out. Just like that, completely gone. And in that moment, Greg knew he wasn't alone anymore. The figure wasn't just in the fire, it was inside his head. The thing in the trees. Now, as we near the end of our terrifying tales, let's talk about something that's haunted many campers across the country. And no, it's not bears or mountain lions. It's something far, far worse. This last story comes from a young woman, Lisa, who was camping with a few friends in the deep forests of North Carolina. It was just another summer trip until the night they encountered something they couldn't explain. As they set up camp, they noticed something unsettling, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. At first, they thought it was an animal, but the growl wasn't like any animal they knew. It didn't sound like a bear or wolf. It sounded wrong, too low, too deep. The group stayed near the fire, watching the trees, hoping whatever it was would leave. But then, the growl stopped, and they heard a different sound. Creaking. Lisa's friends laughed it off, calling her paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. And then, in the dead of night, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard a faint tapping on her tent. She froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The tapping was deliberate. What did she do next? Was it an animal? Was it something worse? I'll leave you with this. Lisa never saw what was tapping at her tent. But when she woke up in the morning, she found something horrifying outside her tent. The Boy Scouts' terrifying night. This story takes us to a Boy Scout campout. Sounds like fun, right? But what happens when a young boy, lone in his tent, is stalked by something that's anything but friendly? At the age of 15, one scout found himself unexpectedly alone on a camping trip. His best friend had bailed at the last minute, leaving him to pitch a tent by himself after a long day of hiking. It wasn't easy. The sun had already set, and the camp was shrouded in darkness. But at least there was some comfort in knowing the rest of the group was nearby. Or so he thought. Later that night, after the usual round of ghost stories and laughter around the campfire, young scout settled into his tent. It didn't take long for sleep to overtake him, but something woke him up. The unmistakable sound of stomping, slowly circling his tent. At first, he assumed it was one of the other scouts, probably off to relieve themselves. But then the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and closer. He called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was the sound of heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. He almost went after them. Almost. But the sense of unease gnawed at him, keeping him frozen in place. And then it came back. The stomping, again and again, going in circles around the tent. This time he couldn't ignore it. His blood ran cold. He unzipped the tent flap, ready to confront what he thought was one of his fellow scouts. But when he looked outside, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. There in the moonlight stood a man, not a scout, but a grown man, towering at least 6'5", with a sinister grin. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. Instead, he placed a finger to his lips. It was if to say, "Don't scream." Frozen with fear, the scout could only stare as the man smiled eerily. Then, like a nightmare, the figure melted into the darkness. Panic surged through the boy's veins. He ran to his scoutmaster's tent, screaming like a child. The adults came, rifles in hand, ready to face whatever had invaded their camp. But when they reached the tent, the man was gone. All that remained were his footprints, a circle around the boy's tent. The next morning, the camp was packed up. The scouts were told to move their tents closer together, like cattle in a pen. And as for the boy, he never went camping again. And after tonight's story, I'm sure many of you won't either. The laughing stranger in the woods. Now imagine this. You and your buddies are deep in the woods, having a blast. The kind of night where everything is funny, even if you're a little tipsy, but then laughter, creepy, unsettling laughter, fills the air. But it's not. You're friends, and it's coming from somewhere out there. This group of friends found themselves camping near the Willamette River. They'd hike deep into the woods, fishing and drinking until the early hours of the morning. The laughter started off as nothing more than a distant sound, maybe from a fellow camper. But soon it was too close, too real. They heard it, a laugh, not one of their own, but the laugh of a man in his 30s or 40s, sounding drunk as if he was just having a good time. But here's the thing, there were no footsteps, no crunch of twigs, just the laugh growing closer. The sound crept closer and closer until it was right at the edge of their campsite. That's when the laughter stopped. Complete silence. And then it happened, a hand, pressing against the fabric of their tent. They screamed, they ran, and for 5 minutes they sprinted through the dark woods until they stumbled upon their car. They didn't look back, but they knew. Something or someone had been out there with them. The man in the wilderness. Imagine you're in the vast Canadian wilderness alone, far from any help. You're taking pictures, capturing the beauty of nature, but then when you get home, you develop the photos, only to find something that shouldn't be there. This backpacker thought he was alone. For days, he didn't see a soul. The nearest town was 3 hours away, and he had the place to himself, or so he thought. When he got home and developed his photos, he found something chilling. 2 pictures of himself, asleep in his tent, taken from outside. He never saw anyone. He never heard anyone, but someone had been watching him, and they had taken his picture while he slept. How and why? He had no answers. And to this day, he's never been camping again. Conclusion. If you're planning your next trip, think twice. Sometimes what you can't see is what you should fear most. And hey, if you enjoyed these creepy tales, subscribe and share. But maybe not while you're out there. You never know who's watching. What's your scariest camping story? Drop it in the comments, and remember, stay safe, stay smart, and don't stray too far from the fire.